Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Duncan-Ryuken-Williams, and he's here to share with us his new book, American-Sutra, a story of faith and freedom in the Second World War. Now, Duncan was born in Tokyo, Japan, to a Japanese mother and British father. After growing up in Japan and England until the age of 17, he moved to the U.S. to attend college and graduated from Harvard University with a Ph.D. in religion. Duncan is currently a professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures and the director of USC Shin-Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Cultures. He's also been ordained since 1993 as a Buddhist priest in the Suto Zen tradition and served as a Buddhist chaplain at the Harvard University from 1994 to 1996. So let's welcome to the show Duncan-Ryuken-Williams.
Thank you so much, Marianne.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I understand it's getting some great reviews.
Yeah, I've had a great opportunity to speak about the book ever since it launched back in February. And it's been getting some good reviews as well as great attendance at book talks. And it's been a very satisfying thing to see a book that took me roughly 17 years from conception to completion, getting good reception out there.
Yeah, books are always such a journey. And so I have to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
So this book, it's about Buddhism and the Japanese-American, World War II incarceration experience. And I think there are quite a lot of books out there about that World War II history and what happened on the home front with Japanese Americans. Over 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry in these camps. But I think this is the first book that's kind of taking the angle of religion or Buddhism as central to both what put them in camp, but also what helped them survive those days. And so I got into it because, not because of any, family history or because I was even trained in Japanese American history or World War II history, but rather because by chance I came across this diary that belonged to my mentor. I went to Harvard for my PhD and did Buddhist studies there, and I was a specialist in medieval and early modern Japanese Buddhism, and so I had nothing to do with World War II. But when my mentor passed away, I found his dad's World War II diaries in his office, and I began translating that diary. And his dad happened to be a Buddhist priest in one of the 10 big internment camps, the World War II Japanese American internment camps. And so he wrote about his time in camp, how he gave sermons on Sundays, how he performed funerals and memorial services for those who died that first winter and spring. And it was just this fascinating diary, and translating from Japanese into English. That was about 17 years ago. And that kicked off a process of translating other diaries and interviewing about 120 camp survivors and trying to learn as best I could of the secondary literature about the subject and producing a book that took that particular new angle.
Well, it's so interesting when we look back and we talk about the internment camps that they had. Thinking that Buddhist people who practice Buddhism would be a national security threat doesn't seem like it even fits.
Right. I mean, today, if we think about the place of Buddhism in America's religious and cultural landscape, we can think about, the Dalai Lama or Oprah interviewing Thich Nhat Hanh or mindfulness, classes at Google or, the first Buddhist elected to Congress, Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat from Hawaii, grilling attorney generals and Supreme Court nominees. So it's a very different era in 2019. But in December of 1941, both security agencies as well as the media of the time and the general public, to be honest, viewed Buddhism as this very mysterious foreign religion that they thought was, if not un-American, anti-American. And in fact, right before Pearl Harbor, in the years prior to Pearl Harbor, I should say, the Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2, and the FBI all had Buddhist temples under surveillance. They put Buddhist priests as a category of person to be listed on these kind of registries as threats to national security, to be arrested if war with Japan would come. And so it was a very different time. And General DeWitt, the person who was the chief architect of the mass incarceration, over 110,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, he named religion, the fact that this population was majority Buddhist, over 2/3 Buddhist. He said that was one of the reasons, along with their race, customs, culture, and their Buddhism, their religion, that he said tied them to the enemy nation of Japan. That's what was at the back of his mind as to why it was necessary to round people up from their homes and put them in camps.
Why do you think it's so important to tell this story now?
I think that story from back then was really about in these moments when, wartime is sometimes these moments when American identity and American national security is questioned, and it's this moment when the values of that time kind of come forth, and unfortunately during World War II there was a moment when, in thinking about who is loyal, who is suspicious, who belongs in America, that these questions, it seems, are enduring ones about how sometimes in American history, inclusion and belonging is a part of the American character, and other times when exclusion, based on the basis of either race, sometimes, or on the basis of religion, at other times, that also seems to happen too. And the reason I think it's worth telling and remembering that World War II story is that we seem to be in another moment when these questions about race, religion, and American belonging are live ones. And so, I think we it's worth looking to history to inform, current conversations about these type of subjects.
I would agree. It really looks like in some ways history may be repeating itself, not to this drastic of a move,
right?
But it's definitely something that as a society we can learn from.
Right. And so it's been interesting to see these parallels, for example, between some of the language, for example, with the travel ban. There's an executive order, that passed constitutional muster, as did, in some sense, the Korematsu, the World War II mass incarceration. It's at the time, the language of these executive orders, they don't specify who the target is. So the President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 doesn't mention Japan or Japanese Americans. It just gives discretion to the U.S. Army to put into camps whoever they deem are a threat to national security, which, by the way, included orphans from 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds from orphanages. The rule was if they had a single drop of Japanese blood, they needed to go to camp. And so that's the kind of understanding of that executive order that was held in 1942. And today, we have these travel bans that, again, doesn't say explicitly the target is, people of one particular religion, but we kind of know that there was an intention about a so-called complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And so we know that sometimes it's religion, and sometimes on the southern border it's more about race. But this idea of kind of who belongs in America, these are unfortunately tough and enduring questions around migration, and as well as once you're inside the boundaries of the United States, who really belongs.
Hmm. Why don't you share a little bit for our listeners what it was like to arrive to these assembly centers and what those centers were?
Sure. So the first thing that happens when people, once the executive order is set and the Army puts up these notices that tell you that you have to report to a civil control station by noon of a certain date. You're allowed to carry what you can. You're allowed to take what you can carry. So that meant for most people like a suitcase. So the first step in that forced removal is this realization that your government is telling you you have between a week, maybe 10 days to, sell your things, settle your affairs. If you're in college, you have to disenroll. If you're, have a business, you have to try to sell it, and then store what you can, but then take that single suitcase of you don't know for how long and where exactly you're going. But these assembly centers, these temporary detention facilities, while the main camps, the 10 big camps, were being built, they were often horse stalls at racetracks or livestock stalls at county fairgrounds. In Los Angeles, the Santa Anita racetracks, or in San Francisco, Tanforan, or in Seattle area, the Puyallup Fairgrounds, these places that basically animals lived not a few weeks ago, and they put some fresh wooden planks on the floor to try to get that stench of horse manure or urine out. But basically, you were suddenly placed in these places where animals had been a few weeks ago, and you were told until these big camps are built, you're going to be here. And so for most people, that meant the summer and into the fall of 1942. They had to try to make some sense of, normalcy and decency in these kind of circumstances that they suddenly found themselves in.
That's just amazing to me. We put people in such substandard conditions and thinking this is okay. And I think it's so important that people really read American Sutra so they get a deep understanding of how people are affected. I mean, I think most people don't understand, and I learned from your book, it's like they had to sell everything they owned. There was no coming back. Right. If they didn't, they lost stuff.
That's right. And, we up in Canada, it was even worse, where it was actually confiscated by the government. And they couldn't return to the Pacific Coast until late in 1946. And so in the United States, you had this kind of mixture of like people desperately trying to sell what they could, usually at very, they would sell their properties at 1/20th of the market value, or if they had a piano or refrigerator, like just cents on the dollar. They desperately try to deal with that circumstance. And again, if you can think of like, if you had to go through your apartment or your house and figure out, because you don't know exactly what kind of weather it's going to be, you don't know for how long, but you have that one suitcase and you have to figure out what are you going to take in that suitcase. That's what, these are people who were just average people. As I said, 2/3 of them were American citizens, and going through college or running a store or running a farm or something like that, and finding themselves suddenly having to figure out what they're going to put in that suitcase.
That's just unreal. And I understand in your book you talk about there was a point in Hawaii where they also had martial law.
That's right. So on the day of Pearl Harbor, martial law gets declared at 3:30 p.m. And actually, even before martial law had been declared at 3 p.m., the FBI began arresting community leaders the very first person they arrest is a man called Gikyo Kuchiba. He's the head Buddhist priest at the main Buddhist temple in Honolulu, Hawaii. And they keep on arresting that day on December 8th, 1941, all these Buddhist priests, as well as other community leaders who were on the FBI's target list. But that martial law included also, of course, the shutting down of radio stations that were Japanese language ones, or the press, and being able to change from a civilian government to a military government. And one of the effects of that was that, under the U.S. Constitution, that there's a principle of religious freedom. But under martial law, you can suspend the Constitution in some aspects. And so one of the policies that they implemented right away was to ban and shut down and discourage Buddhist as well as Shinto temples and shrines, and encourage attendance at Christian churches as a way to, demonstrate loyalty and kind of like belonging in America. And so that was a very particular set of circumstances on the islands of Hawaii, where there was a general martial law that, meant that everybody, didn't matter whether Japanese American or not, there were different rules about air raids and gas masks and different things like that. But there were some things that were specifically targeted to ensure that the Japanese American population also were in some sense under military control.
That's just shocking. It really is, the whole thing shocking. I mean, and from a standpoint too, where they're trying to decide who's loyal, like air quotes on that.
Yeah.
What were some of the techniques that were used to come to those determinations?
So one of the things that happened inside of the camps in 1943, for example, there's something that colloquially is known as the loyalty questionnaire, more formally the leave clearance form. But this is a set of questions, a questionnaire administered by the U.S. Army. And in fact, they looked at certain questions on the form, 27 and 28 in particular, the one that asked about whether one would forswear any allegiance to the emperor, and the other one that asked about whether you'd be willing to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. And if you answered the wrong way, according to the government, on those two questions, like you answered no and no on those, you were segregated, or you were taken out of that camp and placed in a higher security Army-run camp called the Tula Lake Segregation Center. And so this is one of those kind of weird things where, for like the parents who are immigrants, for many of them, if they forswore allegiance to the emperor, they become stateless. So they would tend to want to answer no on that one. And even for those who had, American citizenship, the idea of, serving in the U.S. military, that they would leave the camp, go and serve, while they left behind their siblings, brothers and sisters, and their parents behind barbed wire in an American camp, that struck some people as absurd. And so they answered no on that question. And so people who answered no, and by the way, 33,000 Japanese Americans during World War II served in the U.S. military. So many people answered that call to serve in the U.S. military, despite the irony of all of what was happening. But those people were placed in the segregation camp. So those are the two questions that deemed loyalty most directly. But question 16 on that loyalty questionnaire was about religion. And again, they kind of gradated people as to their loyalty to the United States based on their religious faith and affiliation. So if you answered Christian on that, you got plus 2 points. If you answered Shinto on that question, you were automatically banned from leave clearance. And if you answered Buddhist on that, you got minus 1 point. And so these pluses and minus points on these various questions determined in the government's mind whether one was loyal or disloyal to the United States. And it always occurred to me that that's such a strange way of measuring things, because if you were an actual like spy or intending to, create sabotage or something, you'd probably just answer Christian on that question, knowing that's probably what the government intended or wanted loyal Americans to be. So it really wasn't a good measure, probably, of anything. But these were some of the ways in which loyalty was educated in 1943.
It just sounds so idiotic that they would ask people those questions. It doesn't make any sense. And you're right. If you were, someone who was a spy, you'd probably already know how to answer all those things,
Right. Exactly.
Not like people just trying to live. And what was it like being in the internment camps for the people that were there?
These camps were located in the remote interior parts of the United States, mainly in desert environments. There were 2 camps in Arkansas that were in the midst of a more swampy environment, more humid. Now, these days, they're just like cotton fields. But mainly in these very desert-like environments in Wyoming, Idaho, etc., Arizona, where during the day it would reach temperatures up as high as like 100, 110. During the night, it'd be desert cold. And so when these tar paper barracks were built, they were kind of built hastily. And so I think for most people, the difficulty of living in that kind of extreme heat and extreme cold, the very frail, the elderly and the young, they didn't make it that first winter and spring of 42. And so one of the things that I talk about in my book is the great number of funerals and memorial services that Buddhist priests have to take care of to comfort those families that not only after having lost everything they worked so hard for before the war, but losing family members in camp. So it was that kind of a harsh kind of living condition where you had, communal bathrooms with no partitions between the toilets, or you would eat communally in a mess hall, etc. It was a type of living that your average Japanese American family living in San Francisco or Seattle or they had never experienced something like that before. So it was certainly a big adjustment. And I think when you're in that place of loss, in that place of dislocation, that's when, sometimes you need things that's going to help guide you and help orient you in life. And that's why I think for Buddhists, they turn to Buddhism, Christians turn to Christianity. Faith became an important guide, because if your freedoms have been taken away from you, you're at least trying to find some sense of normalcy, some sense of decency, but also some kind of orientation and at least spiritual kind of freedom if you don't have it on material or physical grounds.
Mm-hmm. Without a doubt. I mean, having everything stripped from you and living where animals used to live.
Yeah.
I couldn't even imagine. And, I don't consider myself too old or too young, but those kind of weather conditions, I probably wouldn't do that good with either. I think most people, they look at that and going through those extremes when you're maybe coming from an environment that, like in Hawaii, it's very tropical, and they don't have those very extreme temperatures.
Right. So it was certainly a very disruptive and difficult adjustment for most families. And again, if you've got a small, baby or a kid that you're trying to get through this, or infirmed grandmother or grandfather in your family, it's just going to be a tough adjustment.
What are some of the things that you learned as you were doing the research on this that surprised you?
I thought that people would be more, bitter, or have, because of all of this, again, their constitutional rights being taken away, the kind of physical shifts in their living conditions, all of these things, that it would just cause a lot of bitterness. And of course, that exists to a certain extent. But what I noticed was, especially those who had some kind of religious or spiritual kind of framework to understand their experience, what I found most surprising was that some people they would talk about being able to, continue their faith, continue their not just kind of on an interior spiritual personal level, but also to be able to continue that faith in community together with other people. I think that gave a lot of people solace and so forth, but be able to continue that not only despite these conditions, but some people I talk about in the book went as far as to say it's almost like as if those difficulties, in Buddhism, they talk about like the karmic conditions, the difficult karmic conditions themselves, actually gave them the opportunity to examine what life meant, what things they valued the most. That kind of incarceration experience was something that allowed them to more deeply consider their life situation. And so that's what I found a little bit surprising sometimes when people would talk about being able to take that very difficult circumstance and make it something that allowed them to actually more deeply come into faith. And so that's one of the surprising discoveries that I made.
What do you feel is the deeper meaning behind your book?
So I think the just like for Buddhists, being able to take their faith, their values, their practice, their community, not for granted, but when you're most tested, to be able to take your faith life and actually actualize what it means to be a Buddhist, or if you're Christian, what it means to have a life that is a Christian life. That sometimes it's these difficult moments when faith is most tested and most necessary to actually embody and enact. And it occurred to me that it's no different than, let's say, how the U.S. Constitution or American ideals and promises of due process, of equality under the law, of religious freedom, these very American values also are tested. And it requires people to actually enact and embody those ideals. And that's, to me, what these Buddhists did during World War II. They were told, you don't belong, that you're a threat to America. But to me, for them to have persisted, to have endured, to have enacted religious freedom, despite their circumstance, to me, that's what was most impressive, or that's the kind of deeper meaning for me of the book, is that, whether it's a teaching in a sacred text or whether it's an ideal in a constitution, that these are just words on a piece of paper unless people embody and enact them, even in the most difficult of circumstances.
Well, I really appreciate that you wrote American-sutra, because I feel that it gives people a view into a part of history that sometimes I think, we would like to forget, but I think it's a huge mistake if we do. I think, we need to learn more about this time in history so that we don't repeat it.
Right. So I that's what I hope people will take away from the book, that it's not just a piece of history to read, but that it's connected to these more enduring questions that have a current iteration as well, and these questions about who belongs in America, who gets to belong, and how do you how do you actually uphold these American values? Unfortunately, these are, I think, our founders intended these values to be something that we actually have to struggle with in each generation and each time. And so it's an interesting moment now to think about, as we said earlier, Buddhism today is so much much more a part of America's religious and cultural landscape. And so that means that in a generation and a bit, attitudes and perspectives can change. And so other groups that are perhaps being targeted today, it takes perhaps some time, maybe a generation and a half, 2 generations for things to shift. But that it does require people to actually engage and think about and consider these questions. And so I hope the book will have some connections to this larger American story as well.
Well, I felt that there was a connection with me and my family's story. Can I share that a little bit? Because I had family that immigrated from Portugal to Hawaii during that time. And there's just so much that goes on. There's so many pieces to this puzzle that we're all a part of. And we need to, of course, I feel like people need to pick up your book, American Sutra, so they can understand that what's happening, be part of the dialogue. Duncan, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
So my book website, it's very simple, www.american-sutra.com. And it's a place that lists all of the events that are upcoming. It lists reviews and of the book, as well as some video trailers about the book. And so that's the hub for learning more.
And all of your upcoming events, I know you're going to be, you're all over the map here, so people can click on your events and, attend one of the discussions and book signings you'll be doing and be part of that event. Duncan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Really appreciate it, Marianne. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Duncan. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, American Sutra. American Sutra is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.